All right, guys. Today we are going to be looking at the Roaring Twenties. So this is post World War I America, what life looked like, what changes were made, and how people lived. So here we go. So our essential question for this lesson is going to be, what role did social and cultural changes play in America during the 1920s? This was a really pivotal time for that, just because there was a new way of life that was kind of introduced that America had never seen before, and we're going to see how that impacted society. So let's start out here. We're going to take a look at, we have our old culture versus new culture. So what did culture in America look like before the 1920s? And then what did it look like after? So old culture emphasizes on traditional values, traditional ways of life, emphasized production. So what we're talking about here is the focus on producing goods. Character was a big thing, and that went into talking about the character of individuals, which was highly valued. Scarcity, there wasn't a lot. Things were rationed out in previous times, and people kind of lived off of just what they needed, and sometimes they didn't even have that. So we're talking essential items: food, clothing, shelter. Old culture also looked at religion quite a bit. Religion was the forefront of life. This is how people lived their lives, what dictated their lives, and a lot of times people built their lives around a religion. People idolized the past. They really looked at the past and how we came to where we're at and how our country was influenced. Local culture. So local culture is going to look at different regions, different areas, and what the culture was like there. There wasn't this unified culture, but it went more to specific areas. And even an area 50 to 100 miles away, their culture could vary quite drastically from their own. And then another piece of old culture is rural areas. A lot of people lived in rural areas and didn't flock to the cities. So now let's take a look at new culture that we have here. New culture is progressive. They're looking for new things all the time, not relying on tradition. Instead of emphasized production, we're looking at emphasized consumption. What can people get? What are they purchasing that they don't need? What are they spending their money on? We're not looking at just goods being produced for people to live day-to-day life, but to help enhance and emphasize new things for life. Personality was a big thing. So where in old culture, character was really valued, personality, individualism is valued a lot more. We're also looking at abundance. When we talked about that emphasized consumption, that's because there's an abundance of goods. People aren't going without things. We also are looking at science. People weren't relying so heavily on religion as much as they were looking forward to science now and scientific explanations, science for reasoning instead of coming from religion. Instead of idolizing the past, people looked to the future. This was a big thing. They weren't just living the day of or the day in front of them, but they were looking toward their future and what that could bring for them. And then we're looking at mass culture here. So instead of that local culture being individualized to specific areas, mass culture was starting to spread throughout the whole country where people had access to the same entertainment, same ways of life, same information they were receiving, which is going to be huge. And then also in new culture, there was there was an emphasis on urban location versus just that rural. People did flock to the cities. There was a lot going on in cities finally. It wasn't left for just, political or industrial movements, but people were living there and making their lives there. So life in the pre-20s, remember that the United States is very spread out, and because it was so spread out, and even today the United States is pretty spread out. We have a really big country, but there was a collection of regional cultures due to the United States being so spread out, where these regional cultures had different practices and different values within their own culture and looked a lot different from someone else, like we talked about before, that might just be only 100 miles away. Life and interests in the pre-20s varied from region to region. This is going out to relating to that regional culture we just talked about. So people did different activities and lived very differently depending on where they lived. And then we also want to remember that most Americans didn't know a whole lot about the rest of the country or the rest of the world. They just lived in their own little bubble, you could say, and really just were not worried, but focused on what affected them directly. All right, so then we have mass media. This was something that was entered into the 20s. So ways of communicating information to large numbers of people. That's what mass media is. We're saying how do people get this information? How do they get the same information? And how do we get it to everyone, not just these local cultures? Let's think about this. How do we get information today? Me being in Salem, Oregon, do I get information differently than someone who lives in Scottsdale, Arizona, or New York City, or let's say in Alabama? Not really. We really have access to the same information. And how do we get access to this? Through a lot of different channels. So one of them is through social media. I think that's huge. That's where a lot of us get our information. Social media started out with MySpace. You guys are definitely probably too young to ever know or remember what a MySpace account was, but that was the first form of social media. Then there's also the internet. I still want to go back to social media though for a minute. We had MySpace, sorry about that guys. Then we have Facebook. People definitely use Facebook quite a bit. I know you guys say that Facebook is for old people, but hey, guess what? It's still popular and it's still going. There's Instagram, where you're posting pictures. You are globally connected with Instagram. You're globally connected with all of these, but I think Instagram really shows that, means that it's focused on pictures and people are writing captions about where they're at, what they're doing in any place of the world. And then a lot of companies and a lot of news sources use Instagram to filter out their information and get it out to others as well. We also have Snapchat. You can virtually be friends with anyone on Snapchat, just like other outlets or social media outlets, but Snapchat's a good way where we get more individualized information, but then you can subscribe to people who are more influential and can get you that as well. There's TikTok videos. That's new to me, but I know a lot of people are using TikTok just to show what they're doing in quarantine and what their daily lives look like. And I know there's a lot more social media accounts. There's Twitter. I don't know a whole lot about Twitter, but I know it's used quite a bit. All of these are because of the internet. The internet is another way that we get our information. So with the internet, we can Google pretty much anything that we want, or not just Google, but any search engine. Sorry, guys. And I think this is really important to know. Before, and even in my time, I can speak to not having a lot of access to the internet. When we were given our research projects, we actually had to physically, believe it or not, go into the library and look through books. We had to look through encyclopedias. man, I remember the encyclopedia sets. There's tons of them, probably close to 30 books of encyclopedias, and people would go around to your house selling them. And I was so envious about not having one. That was something that wasn't quite in our family's budget, but that had almost anything listed in there. And it was structured kind of like a dictionary, alphabetically, where you could look up topics, and then they would give you different topics that were related to that you could look up as well. And so we used the encyclopedia, we used the libraries. A library, and you had to learn how to use the Dewey Decimal System. You're probably thinking, what's that? Well, the Dewey Decimal System was something that you had to learn to show where books were located, whether they were fiction, nonfiction, what section they were in, who the author was, and that's how our information was organized. And once again, what's crazy is I can remember this and remember getting my information that way. So the internet, there's no need for the encyclopedias. I think they're important still, but you can look up anything. You can look up the meaning to a word. You can look up what's going on in different countries politically, news. You can look up pictures, geographic locations. You can literally type in your question into a search engine and get information. The resources that the internet provides is unreal, unbelievable. For instance, the internet is the way that I'm receiving my teaching degree. I had to work full time. I don't really have the option not to. And I needed something that was convenient, where I didn't have to go to class every day, and I can do it on my own time. And the internet has allowed that. So to think about being able to get a degree in a full college education online is crazy. So other ways we get information, newspapers. Newspapers aren't quite delivered as much as they were used to. When I was younger, we had a paper route where you had to get up early in the morning and take all the newspapers and deliver them to homes so that people had them before they woke up and had their morning coffee, so they could have that to start their day out. But with a newspaper, man, you're still getting access to the newspaper online. The newspaper, even on my own social media accounts, I follow local and larger newspapers, international, national level, and I get my information that way. And so although we still have the newspaper, we still kind of filter back to the internet. The radio gives us information. Nowadays we rely on the radio for music and listening to what we want. But even the radio, just like the newspaper, is outdated a little bit. Most people have their own music accounts, such as Pandora or Spotify, where you get to choose what you're listening to. You get to make your own playlist. You don't have to listen to just what the local station is choosing to play. And that's pretty cool too. TV. We get our information from TV through various TV shows, news broadcastings. That's all out there. And even, I don't have cable at this point, so I don't get a lot of my information from TV. But then when I think about it, I kind of do, because I watch a lot of documentaries on Netflix, and that's a great way to receive information. And then also blogs. People get to share their own personal stories, their own personal specialties, and what they do through blogging. And so if we think about it, we really have information given to us, and it's at our hands at any given point. I think that's pretty amazing. So, because back then in the 1920s, which ones existed and were invented back then? Movies were available. There was newspaper. There was radios, and there was also jazz culture, which we'll get into, which is pretty important as well. So first, I think something that we should focus on in the 1920s before we get into our way our information is delivered is, let's talk about that shift in culture and society for a moment. So flappers are kind of a great way to introduce this, I believe, because this was a new woman. This was a new way that women were behaving, dressing, socializing. So a flapper was a young woman who is rebellious, energetic, fun-loving, and bold. Here is a quote from Preston Slauson from The Great Crusade and after, who kind of details that a little bit more. He talks about them being breezy, slingy, and informal in manner, slim and boyish in form, covered in silk and fur that clung as close to her as onion skin, with carmine cheeks and lips, plucked eyebrows, and close-fitting helmet of hair, gay, plucky, and confident. So this relates back to how we talked about being traditional and being progressive. A flapper was definitely progressive, behaving differently than women had before. All these things right here were new, a new approved way for women to behave. Not approved by everyone, but many older Americans, they still held traditional to their views of how young women were supposed to behave in public, and they disapproved of their display of their free manners, but also of the young men who flocked around these flappers. That was a big thing. Women weren't seen like that. They were generally covered head to toe almost in clothing and a little bit more modest in their appearance. If we look at these photos right here, we've got these women, look how fun they are. They're adventurous. They're walking on the top of a tall building. They've got their short hair. You can see their bright red lipstick. Their skirts aren't down to their ankles. This gal's skirt right here is even above her knees. And then their fun shoes, and they're smiling and having fun. They're having a great time. The picture here on the right, you see a woman sitting here with a man working with her dress very, very high up. That wasn't seen before, especially in a photograph made public for others. Her hair is short, and then once again, she's got those bold lips we're talking about. Even though they only represented a small number of American women, the flapper image had a high impact on fashion and behavior. Like we just saw in those photos, shorter dresses, knee length, sometimes even higher. They had short bobbed hair and close-fitting hats to accent their new hairstyle. They didn't have the big, long brimmed hats that were seen before. They wanted people to see their hair and see their face. Heavy makeup. Heavy makeup in the past was formerly only associated with actresses or prostitutes. And so now it's becoming more acceptable to see these everyday women wearing this full face of makeup. The flapper image, they were drinking in public, and they weren't just sipping on a glass of wine. They were drinking whiskey and things like other men, and they had no shame in doing it in public. And then they were also smoking in public. These are things that you just didn't see women do before the 1920s, really. We can see here this image on the left, this fur shawl this woman's wearing, her sleeveless dress right at her knees, her short hair, heavy makeup, big jewelry. And then also this image right here on the right shows these women in these short outfits, smiling, just having a fun, energetic time. So we're going to continue talking about their changing roles. This picture here, this is what women were, what they looked like more before the 1920s. And so women stood at the center of much of the social change during this time. Although both married and single women had been in the workforce for a long time, during the war, those numbers rose. And then we also want to remember that convenience was key for young women during this time. So, women in the workforce, that's important to talk about. Generally, they were single white women. Often they were working in clerical positions. But you got to remember, businesses still remained prejudiced. They weren't completely free, I guess you could say, like we are today. Many hospitals refused to hire female doctors. Many law firms either rejected female lawyers or offered them secretarial jobs. An employer seldom trained women for jobs beyond an entry-level position. Pay was not as high for women as it was men. They were definitely paid less. And then if women became married or pregnant, their employees are expected them to quit. So now we're going to take a look at a contract, or more so an agreement of a woman back in the 1920s who was working. This is hard to read, so let me I'll summarize it for you. But this is an agreement between Miss Jones, who's a teacher, and the Board of Education of Middleton School, where she agrees to teach for a period of 8 months beginning in September 1923. The Board of Education agrees to pay Miss Jones the sum of $75 per month. So in order to receive that and keep her job, this is what she has to agree to. She has to agree to not get married. This contract becomes null and void immediately if the teacher marries. Not to keep any company with men, so not to be hanging out with them. She is to be home between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. unless she is in attendance at a school function. She is not to loiter downtown in ice cream parlors. She is not to leave town at any time without the permission of the chairman of the Board of Trustees. She is not to smoke cigarettes. This contract becomes null and void immediately if the teacher is found smoking. She is not to drink beer, wine, or whiskey. This contract becomes null and void immediately if the teacher is found drinking beer, wine, or whiskey. She is not to ride in a carriage or automobile with any man except for her brothers or her father. She is not to dress in bright clothes. Now, bright doesn't only mean color, but very eccentric clothing, you could say. She is not to dye her hair. She is to wear at least 2 petticoats. She is not to wear dresses more than 2 inches above the ankle. She's to keep the schoolroom clean, to sweep the classroom floor, scrub the floor at least once a week with soap and hot water, clean blackboards daily, start the stove at 7 a.m. so that the room will be warm by 8 a.m. when the children arrive, and to carry out the ashes at least once a day. And then her last piece of the contract was not to use face powder, mascara, or paint the lips. Here's the deal: as someone who's potentially being offered a teaching contract, I don't think they would have given me the job. I don't think that a lot of these things would become null and void for me. So life was definitely different back then than it is today, as we can see by this agreement. So with these changes, we talk about women being kind of the face of the social change in the 1920s. I think it's important that we just at least touch on voting. Even though women could vote in all elections as of 1920, few did. If so, they voted along the same lines as men. 1/3 of women said that they lacked interest. 11% said that they did not think women should vote at all. Early on, women didn't exercise their rights to vote for a number of reasons. One of them was they had to make special arrangements to get to the polls, because this might be that they lived in a rural area or away from the polls, or that they had children to look after. Another reason is that families discouraged them from voting, and then some just plain weren't comfortable doing it. So even though I think it's important to see, even though they were able to vote, there was still a lot of barriers preventing them from doing so. So now that we've kind of talked on women, I think let's go into a little bit more of the cultural changes that we're starting to see. And I want to look at American heroes, and who, before we saw generally people in politics or in war who were considered heroes, but now everyday people were being seen as heroes for entertainment value. One is Charles Lindbergh. His nickname was Lucky Lindy, and he became famous because he flew from New York to Paris non-stop. Can you believe that, guys? He didn't have an autopilot switch if he grew tired, and he didn't have anyone else with him, which meant he was flying solo, and he had to stay awake the entire flight. So if you think about that, flying from New York to Paris nonstop by yourself without having the chance to get on autopilot, that's pretty impressive. Amelia Earhart, she was inspired by Lucky Lindy, and she was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. So she kind of went in his footsteps. She tried to actually fly solo around the world in 1937, but after completing 2/3 of the trip, she and her navigator disappeared mysteriously while crossing. I have a big typo there. One, ocean isn't spelled right. I'm sorry about that. And Pacific, it's actually the Atlantic Ocean is where she disappeared. So I apologize, guys. See, as teachers, we make mistakes too, and I appreciate your grace. So I'll get that fixed for you. So here's a picture of Amelia Earhart. Look at, she's got some short hair there, and her flying in the cockpit of a plane. And then here's a picture of Lucky Lindy in front of his airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis. Sports heroes. There's Jim Thorpe. He was a professional football player. So he actually participated in the Olympics, doing various types of marathons, and he won Olympic gold medals for this. And he was elected the first president of what later became the National Football League. Do you guys know what that is? The National Football League. Is that something that's even around today? Yep, sure is. That's the NFL. We also have George Herman, who's also known as Babe Ruth. He had careers with the Boston Red Sox and then the New York Yankees. He was just an incredible baseball player. He has 714 home runs, a record that was unbroken for almost 40 years. And then in 1927, he set a record of 60 home runs in a 154 game season. Pretty impressive. I, in my spare time, like to play slow pitch softball. I'm not that great at it, but it's a fun hobby. And I tell you what, I have never hit one home run. So I would consider Babe Ruth a hero in my eyes. All right, here's a picture of Babe Ruth. We can see right here, swinging that bat. He probably just hit a home run. And then here's a picture of Jim Thorpe in his football gear. What's actually pretty interesting about him too is that Jim Thorpe is a Native American, and that was pretty awesome for him to make such great strides back during that time and to be recognized for that. Just something to note, kind of a cool fact there. Okay, so let's talk about movies. Movies became huge in the 1920s. It was the fourth largest business in the United States in the 1920s. Most films were silent up until 1927. When they had movies that weren't silent, they were called talkies. And so the first talkie was a movie called The Jazz Singer, where people actually spoke. It wasn't just a silent film. 80 million people went to the movies every week. That's crazy because the population back then was only at 120 million. So you're seeing a majority, definitely over half, that are going to the movies. The first movie stars were Charlie Chaplin. We have Greta Garbo and Lillian Gish. You might recognize some of those names, and this is why they're so famous. We also have newspapers and magazines. So the New York Times was a magazine that started, or a newspaper that started out at 14 pages and went up to 50 pages per day. People cared about different things now. They cared about fashion, sports, entertainment, world events, crime, scandal. This is where tabloids came out. People wanted to see what was going on. They loved that juicy gossip that we do, and so Star Magazine, that's what you have to think of things coming out during this time. Magazines that also came out were the Reader's Digest, still going on today, Ladies' Home Journal, and they added color and advertisements to these. And so this was new during the 1920s. Radio was big. So in 1920, the first radio station was KDKA in Pittsburgh. By 1922, 60,000 homes had a radio, and by 1929, 10,250,000 had a radio. That's crazy. Stations played the same programming, and things you could find on the stations were sports, jokes, news, commercials, church services, and music. So this was also a time during this time was the Jazz Age. This was pretty cool too, because this was a new wave music. It was seen as fun and flowy, and it was more on the spot. It wasn't predetermined and where everything sounded clean and thought out. This is where you'll see a lot of fun dancing starting to happen. So radio and the Great Migration made jazz widely popular. People wanted to hear it and they wanted to see it live. So people flocked to jazz clubs and dance halls. This was new. So this was, we see this a lot where different restaurants or venues with big concerts, or, you know, a lot of times bars will have music available. But these were specific, and people loved it because they would go, they would see these entertainers, they were having fun, they were playing music spontaneously for the crowd, and the crowd was loving it, and they were dancing all night. Like I said, it was fast. It was free-flowing, and it was fun. There's no method to it. Some people that were famous during this jazz age were Duke Ellington and then also Louis Armstrong. So we also had some cultural conflicts that happened in the 1920s. When you bring about a lot of change, not all of it is positive, and I think it's important that we touch on that as well. So the Scopes trial, what that focuses on was the teaching of evolution. So we talked about this before. The teaching of evolution was talking about progression in science versus the Bible. When we talk about the Bible is religious, and that goes back to that traditional culture that we talked about in the beginning. And then teaching of evolution is that science-based, which is that new culture, more progressive. So at this time, though, it was against the law to teach about evolution, and Mr. Scopes admitted that he did it. There was a 10-day trial, and it was about being guilty or not guilty, but more importantly, about what direction America was going to go toward. Was America going to use this as an example and say, nope, we're not doing this. We're going to stick with our regular ways, and we're going to continue to teach from the Bible about this? Or is someone going to say, hey, wait, time out. Why can't we teach about evolution? Why can't we teach science-based? We're progressing. We're moving forward. And so this was a big, important historical event to kind of determine that. I think it's important for us to kind of stop and take a moment of what values does religion teach? I'm not asking about your religion, if religion's right or wrong. We're not talking about that. But when we think about it, what values does religion teach? We can probably agree that religion tries to teach how to be a good human. And what does being a good human mean? Obeying your father and mother. Respect for individuals, I think, is a big one. To love others, thou shalt not kill their neighbor. So to treat others how you would want to be treated, isn't that the number one rule, the golden rule, they say? What about other values, such as doing things that aren't harmful to your body? Marriage is something that religion teaches, and the value and importance of marriage, and also the disagreement with infidelity. Those are just a few that I've thought of. Let's take a moment and let you write a few down, okay? Okay, so grab your pencil and then write some down. Thanks. All right, thanks guys. So now let's talk about, have many Americans lost these values today? What do you think? Do you think that Americans would be better off being taught from religion? It's a tough one. It's very tough. I don't think it's fair to say that Americans have lost values of being good humans and trying their best and respecting others and being a good family. But if we taught from religion, do you think that we would maybe have less crime, less social issues, less issues with drugs and alcohol abuse? It's hard to say. I think that this is something we'll get further into going on, but you guys did great, so thanks. All right, so another issue that kind of came up was fundamentalism. And so fundamentalism, this challenged new ideas. So science and technology were starting to take a larger role in everyday life compared to what we were talking about with religion playing that important role. War and other modern society problems were making people question God's decisions and the existence of God. That's huge, especially when you have war and other big issues that come up. Is when someone puts their faith and trust in God, and it makes them wonder, why is this happening to me? And I think the society on a whole was starting to see this. And then scholars were questioning the Bible and its historical inaccuracies. So you're having scholars starting to what you could say is put their ideas out there, which makes other people think twice. Is the Bible correct? Is this what we should be basing our values off of? Is this how we should is this how we should have our way of life be? This was really controversial because a lot of people, this was their way of life, and this was the only way of life that they knew for generations and generations. This is the way it was always done. So is it okay to veer from that? What was wrong with the way things have been done and being taught with just religion? There were definitely a lot of differing views, and it's important that we can kind of put ourselves in their perspective to try to see the capacity and how big this was. So then you had fundamentalists. They didn't like these ideas that scholars were saying. They didn't like that they were trying to push science and take the value away from religion and what religion has to offer and has to teach. So they encouraged church. They used radio and mass media, like we talked about before. They were holding church services over the radio, and this allowed them to make sure that people all over the country had access to these services. They argued that everything in the Bible happened, and it is the absolute truth. So you have these scholars and scientists over here saying, well, I don't know. And they're saying, no, this was it. These are kind of the traits of a fundamentalist. They're fighting hard for what they believe in. And you can't blame someone for fighting hard what they believe in. That's what America is the freedom, right? They also spoke of the evils such as drinking, gambling, prostitution, that the loss of church values have caused. So when we talked about that, have we lost any values? Drinking was something that was definitely increasing during this time period, more so than it ever had been before. People were gambling, which was often associated with drinking. And then there was a lot of prostitution too. And so these evils, they were saying, when people don't go to church, this is what happens. And then that same group that started they're the same group that started the prohibition movement. So they weren't having this. They wanted to fight hard to keep their church values. That's what made them a fundamentalist. An example of someone is Billy Sunday on CD, just someone who's very evangelical and very, very determined to keep their church alive because it was slipping away. Okay, I think that's something, another cultural conflict we want to definitely touch base on are some racial tensions. Now, we want to remember, why did African Americans migrate to the North? When we think back, they were going to the North for job opportunities. That was huge. And they were just looking for a new way of life with maybe a little bit less prejudice, less racial tensions than what was happening in the South. But unfortunately, what they found in reality was still racial prejudice and violence. The violence, that's a hard one to grasp, but it was still going on, and it was heavy, and it's going to get even worse as we move forward. But we'll save that for another class, maybe next year even. There's a time period called the Red Summer, which is where there was an abundance of riots between white citizens and black citizens in northern cities. And remember, they had migrated up north for a better way of life, and they're still faced with these issues that are going on. This a pivotal moment started when a 17-year-old black boy was struck in the head with a rock by a white man while swimming off of out in the river. And that was a huge thing because a lot of people thought that man should have been punished for it, but he was claiming it was self-defense. And so once again, though, we're going to relate back to these racial tensions that were going on, and it wasn't all happy and fun for everyone. Something that we can take a look at with these racial tensions that came about, well, not came about, but sparked, was the Ku Klux Klan. So in 1915, the Ku Klux Klan had barely existed. Wasn't really around, wasn't a big deal. No one really knew about it. In 1922, so that's 7 years later, there were 100,000 members. So barely existing to 100,000 members. Now we're going to jump forward by 2 years and go to 1924. And then we're at 4 million people in 2 years. And so when we talked about those racial tensions and the amount of violence that African American people were receiving, we can definitely take a look at these numbers and see why that increased. Here's a statement from the Klansman Manual that was put out in 1925. Klansmen are to be examples of pure patriotism. They are to organize the patriotic sentiment of native-born white Protestant Americans. So the KKK was against all races that weren't white. So a good question for this is, who are the people that made up the KKK? A lot of these people were, I would guess, ding, 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 native-born white Protestant Americans. And what was something that they standed to lose with America progressing? When America is progressing, we're starting to see things differently. We're starting to see people differently, accept differences, and go away from those traditional values. Being a native white-born Protestant American is definitely more traditional than more progressive. And so that's, what they stand to lose was everything that they had believed in. So as we can see, there was a lot of good that came out and a lot in the 1920s. We're looking at a lot of progression. The entertainment thing is huge in itself. People finally had money to be able to spend on entertainment. And why did they finally have money? Remember back the end of World War I? We talked about that people, we had sold a lot of weapons to other countries, and that we are being paid back loans that we had lent to other countries. And so we were at a point where we could start spending our money on other things besides food, clothing, shelter, but also now we could spend it on entertainment. If you were a flapper, you could buy the silks and the furs and the makeup that you wanted. People were going to the movies. They were buying magazines. They were buying the newspapers. People, as we saw, had radios in their household now. And so we talked about this emphasized consumption and abundance of products rather than being limited. And this was a big shift, and we can see how it made this shift toward people in their daily lives and how society had changed. So I think that's it for now. But let's take a break and then we'll review and connect back, and we will see you later. Bye, guys.